Welcome! If you're watching this lesson, then you've made it pretty far in your Kaplan course. This lesson, lesson 5.7, is going to focus on MCAT expertise and MCAT strategies, just like everything else in this chapter, but it's going to bring together everything you've seen in the Chapter 5 lessons and put it all into action together. What you're going to see in this lesson are a couple passages and then questions attached to them, but this is what you've got to do the whole time. Turn on your memory, because every single question that we see is going to have some patterns in it that call back to things you've seen earlier on in the course. That's why this lesson is here and what we're going to practice, because that's the exact same thing you're going to do on test day. You're going to walk into the MCAT and you're going to remember the hundreds of hours of studying that you've done and then apply the patterns that you recognize, use strategies, and then ace the exam. Every question that we see in this lesson is going to have the same prompt, and that prompt is, what can you learn from this question? That gets to the very heart of what good test prep is all about. Every question that you see between now and test day, you're going to have to ask yourself that same question. What can you learn from it? Because every question that you see between now and test day is a little more experience that you build and can then apply to get a great score. The learning goals, things you're going to be better at if you watch and follow this lesson, are the use of the 4 major Kaplan strategies that you've seen in previous lessons. You're going to see distinct nods to the triage strategy, the passage strategy, question strategy, and moving through answer choices. As a quick review, the passage strategy is scan, read, label, and reflect. It's going to build an outline of every passage that you see. And then the question strategy is, of course, assess, plan, execute, and answer. Starting with a glance at the question, making a plan of what you'll do, then executing that plan. So let's get rolling with the first of 2 passages. Take 3 minutes right now, no more than 3 minutes, just like on test day, to read and outline this practice passage number 1. Don't do the questions quite yet, just read and outline. This passage, as you probably realized rather quickly, is about one of the highest difficulty, biggest challenges on biology of the MCAT, and that is not just the kidney, but the countercurrent multiplier in the kidney. This passage starts by introducing the kidney and the multiplier. Then it walks through 6 steps, both in text and also in the figure at the end of the passage. What these 6 steps explain is how the loop of Henle in every nephron of your kidney can take a situation of equal concentration. We start out in step 1 with all 300 milliosmoles everywhere. How your kidney can take that situation and turn it into what we're more used to and the way the kidney functions. After the 6 steps are repeated multiple times, we end up with 1200 milliosmoles of concentration at the bottom of the loop of Henle. Now, a key point is, if you saw this passage on test day and you weren't already familiar with the content, you would not be expected, and you should not try to completely internalize and understand every single detail here. There's tons of details in this diagram, and the countercurrent multiplier is infamously complicated. Now, part of the way you avoid having to do that is you study the countercurrent multiplier before you walk in on test day, but this is a complicated piece of content. There are a lot of things you could spend your time studying that will get you points faster than becoming a total master on the countercurrent multiplier. So the other takeaway is that if you see a passage like this on test day, where it maybe goes a little bit deeper into the content that you're comfortable with, you just got to focus on a few key takeaways while still taking no longer than those 3 minutes that you've budgeted to spend on the text of a passage. The key details here can be found by following the steps. Step 1 starts at constant concentration everywhere, but step 2 starts this narrative by talking about pumps in the ascending loop of Henle that increase the concentration in the interstitial space. In step 3, the descending limb becomes isotonic with the interstitial space. In step 4, that newly concentrated 400 milliosmoles moves down the loop of Henle, pushing some of that higher concentration up the ascending loop. Then that higher concentration is again pumped out by the pumps in the ascending loop. The descending loop finds equilibrium with the interstitial space, and then you repeat steps 4 through 6. This loop, repeating over and over again, moves the concentration at the bottom of the loop from 400 to 500 over and over again, all the way up to the 1200 that we recognize. If you're really familiar with this content, then you're probably nodding your head vigorously right now. If you're not familiar though, then if you saw this on test day, you'd probably want to save it for one of the last passages of the section, but eventually you'd want to give the questions the best shot you can. So in order to get to the questions, let's review an outline and what we can learn from this passage. Remember, the passage was about the countercurrent multiplier. We get a list of the steps that bring about the high concentration through the countercurrent multiplier, and then we had a figure that traced those steps. The major takeaways though, the MCAT expertise you can build from this passage are the takeaways that your passage structure here, as much as the content was complicated, you could tell what this passage was about just by taking a glance at it, just by doing the scan step of the passage strategy. There was a list and a diagram that followed that list. This passage also shows us that what passages tend to do is take content that the MCAT expects you to really know, the basic facts of the kidney, and goes a little deeper. It'll either apply it to an experiment or a disease, or explore a really deep aspect of that content, like it does here. And being ready for that on the real MCAT will give you that much more confidence. And finally, from a strategic aspect, this is really complicated text, but note that we were able to make very short labels in our outline. That's what outlines are all about. Writing just a few words to prove to yourself that you understand each element of a passage, and then using it for reference later. That brings us to the 3 questions associated with this passage. Since on test day you'll have 1 minute per question, take 3 minutes now to answer those questions, and then we'll go over them and see what we can really learn from them. Answer the 3 questions, take 3 minutes now. This first question piles another diagram, another figure on top of the one from the passage. It explains something called countercurrent heat exchange. The diagram shows us that countercurrent heat exchange in certain organisms places arterioles right next to venules in the circulatory system. Now, since arterioles move away from the heart and out towards the outer body, naturally arterioles are going to be moving from an area of heat to an area of cold. So what this diagram is telling us is that the arterioles bring the heat from the hot area of the body and then place the arteriole next to the venule, which is coming from a cold area of the body. Since the arteriole is right next to the venule, that means the heat from the arteriole can move into the venule, therefore keeping the interior of the body warm and preventing the veins and venules from bringing cold fluid into the interior of the body and lowering body temperature. The question then asks, which part of the kidney's countercurrent multiplier system is the most like heat in this system? And the answer is B. If you take the diagram from this question and rotate it 90 degrees, it looks an awful lot like the loop of Henle from the passage. In both cases, the body is taking 2 tubes with fluid moving in opposite directions and putting them next to each other. And in both cases, that system allows the body to get more of something it wants in the right place. In the case of the heat exchange system, it gets heat in the interior of the body. And in the case of the kidney's countercurrent multiplier system, it gets concentration of solutes into the adrenal medulla. Since the countercurrent heat system tries to concentrate heat and the kidney system concentrates solutes, those 2 items are analogous to each other. In fact, if you'd never thought about it that way before, maybe this question will help you understand the countercurrent multiplier in the first place. In any case, let's see what we can learn from this question. And in this case, and all other ones in this lesson, write down what you can learn from each question, because what we can learn from these 6 questions put together is going to be a really good sampling of all the great strategy and expertise you want to take into test day. This question shares with so many other MCAT questions that it'll bring together multiple different science topics. In this case, we have the kidney in the passage coming together with the circulatory system in the question, and we saw some interplay and similarities between them. Also, depending on how you solve the question, it can show us that prediction is an extremely powerful tool. That's why it's one of the main ways you want to try to get to an answer on your practice and on the real test. If you read this question and your head's up enough to realize, hold on, this heat seems just like solutes in the kidney, it'll get you to a quick, high confidence answer and move on to the next question. Speaking of which, let's see question 2. This question said, well, suppose the flow rate increases in the loop of Henle. Then the question doesn't quite ask what happens next. It asks a yes or no of, would the kidney have to act in order to prevent a deviation from homeostasis? In other words, if you rephrase this question, if flow rate increases through this countercurrent multiplier, would it mess things up? Because if it would mess things up, then those transport mechanisms will need to act in order to prevent that. And the answer here is A. Those mechanisms will have to act. If flow rate increases, then by default, the countercurrent multiplier wouldn't have as much time to do the pumping and regulation that it needs. If the countercurrent multiplier is overloaded and the ascending loop of Henle doesn't have time to pump those solutes out into the interstitium, those solutes just go flying by without the chance to get pumped out, then the multiplier system isn't going to work as much. And since the function of the multiplier is to increase osmolarity, then a failure of that would be a decrease in osmolarity. So that's what needs to get prevented here. What this question can teach us for the future, besides just the content itself and understanding the way the kidney works, is first the pattern of yes-no questions. You've probably seen dozens of these questions before, and you will see many, many more before you take the real exam, and you're going to see them on the real exam. Every single time you see the pattern of answer choices that say yes, yes, no, no, those questions are all going to have very similar plan and execute steps. You're always going to have two angles to approach the question. If you immediately know the answer is yes or no, that will eliminate answer choices. And if you know the reason why, that can help you eliminate answer choices. So not only do yes, no questions have similar approaches, any questions with similar structure will have similar approaches. That's why you want to see questions with similar structure over and over again before you take the exam. That's the very heart of MCAT expertise. Some other things this question illustrates are how complex cause and effect can be in hard skill 2 questions. This question requires that you follow flow rate increasing so the multiplier can't work as much, and if the multiplier doesn't work as much, then by default osmolarity would decrease, and so yes, these mechanisms have to prevent that decrease. That's a lot to hold in your mind at once, especially in a stressful situation on test day. So you need to realize that the MCAT is going to ask you to think that way, and you need to practice, practice, practice to be ready to think that way under pressure. Finally, this question has a little insight into answer choices. It shows us that opposite answer choices are pretty common traps on the science section. Choices A and B, for instance, are completely identical except for this word, increase versus decrease. That's one of the reasons it's so important to keep the logic straight, because if you miss one step, that might be a reversal step and you'll end up with that trap opposite answer. But it also means that when you have to guess on a question, one of those two opposite answer choices is often the right one. Now, you don't want to have to guess too much on test day, but this is a strategy you want in your back pocket either way. Let's check out the last question from this passage then, which, relatively speaking, is probably the easiest of the three, or at least the quickest. It asks us to describe the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. The answer here is D. The thick ascending limb, or the one on the right-hand side of the figure in the passage, pumps solutes into the interstitium, which means it is diluting the filtrate. That's why we call it the diluting segment of the nephron. And the pattern we should notice from this question, what we can learn from it, is that it's a pseudo-discrete. Not only is it a pseudo-discrete, but it's a relatively short question. Now, you're not going to get every short question correct on test day, especially if it's about really hard science content, but all other things being equal, these types of questions are the ones you can move through very quickly. If you can afford to spend 15 or 20 seconds on a question like this, that allows you an extra 40 or 45 seconds on a harder question somewhere else in the section. Every time you see a question like this, you should have a little party, because it means you're going to save a little time. And another major pattern this question illustrates for us is that basic content can be a big deal in terms of points. It's important to keep a sense of perspective. A lot of times, students get frustrated by the fact that they don't know the really deep, intense stuff. But sometimes it's more important to have a breadth of content than depth of content in any one given area. Because sometimes you'll just get a quick recall question like this and it will get you a whole point, just as much of a point as a really high difficulty, deep content question. Not only can the basic content get you points, but the basic content is also a stepping stone to get more complicated points. Even with this question, where the answer was very quickly, oh, it's the diluting segment of the nephron, there is a very basic piece of content hidden in there in that you need to know what dilution means. In fact, you need to know what dilution means without even thinking about it. You probably didn't have to think about it when you did this question, but way back when you first learned about this in general chemistry, you probably did have to put a little effort towards simple, basic content like dilution versus concentration. Well, right now in your MCAT studies is the time you're spending memorizing more basic content so that you can recall it instantly on the test. And never forget that that will happen and it will get you points. And now we'll attack the second passage of this lesson. The exercise is going to be similar. We're going to see the passage, do the questions, and then see what we can learn, what expertise we can build from each question. But just like test day, it's going to take those patterns and twist them a little bit. We'll see slightly different types of questions. We'll see slightly different types of content. This time, do the passage and the questions. This time the passage is a little short, so give yourself 2 minutes for the passage and 3 minutes for the questions. 5 minutes total. Do the passage, make an outline, answer the questions, and then we'll go over it and see what we can learn. This passage, similar to the last one, is about a process in the body that you probably recognize, but you may not have memorized. See, even within this very lesson, we have two passages that have different content areas but the same underlying pattern. A process you need to be very familiar with for test day, but we'll go even deeper into that content. This one's about the citric acid cycle. Then we get a figure that gives us the details of the citric acid cycle, along with all the intermediates and the enzymes that help that happen. Now, you gotta stay calm. It's not like you need to have a photographic memory before you go to the questions, but notice that we start with pyruvate, move into acetyl-CoA, then we go around the cycle, starting with citrate, ending with oxaloacetate, and in the process, we lose carbon dioxide in a couple places, and we take NAD and FAD and we reduce them to NADH and FADH2, along with some direct phosphorylation of GDP into GTP. This should all be really familiar to you right now. It's what the citric acid cycle is all about. Then this passage spends its last paragraph again expanding upon cell metabolism, specifically talking about disorders. It gives us a nice nod to genetics by talking about mutations, and then talks about the expression of those mutations. This is again a great pattern to look for over and over again, and on test day, where a few key science buzzwords like genes and mutation tell us that this passage is not just going to be about respiration, but it's also going to be about genetics. So this passage, your outline, probably looks something like this. It's about the citric acid cycle. We get a diagram of what it is, all of the details, and then it expands into disorders. And that second paragraph ends saying that often you end up with issues about the TCA cycle in the neuromuscular system, if not everywhere else. And then remember what this lesson and our learning goals here are all about, what we can learn from this passage, the patterns that are shown here that we'll see in slightly different iterations on test day. One of them is about how to identify what science is being tested. In a half second looking at this passage, you probably realize this was about cellular respiration because you noticed the figure. That's what the scan step of the strategy is all about. It's why the ScanStep is valuable. Not only does it allow you to make good expectations about the passage, but it also allows you to decide whether to triage the passage, skip it, move to the next one, if that is not your favorite content area. And then also a way to calm yourself down is to remind yourself, because you probably saw when you did the questions to this passage, that not every detail in that passage is going to have a question about it. That would be impossible. There are 30 to 40 details in that one figure alone. But it's impossible for one question to test more than a couple of those. And there's only 4 or 5 questions for every passage. That's why attacking passages on the science section is so much about looking for structure and the big ideas so that you can just go back to the passage later and find the details you need. Let's hit the questions then. Question 4 takes the general case of the last paragraph of the passage, those genetic defects, and says specifically, what if a genetic defect messed up fumarase? And the answer to this one is C. If fumarase was non-functional in some tissues, then, well, we'd have less NADH synthesized from the cycle in those tissues. And when you lay it out like that, this answer follows the content you're probably familiar with in this subject. Enzymes get messed up, so we get fewer of those electron-carrying molecules, like NADH. But the difficulty in this question is slogging through the rest of the answer choices to get to that choice C, which probably stood out to you once you actually got there. Things from this question that you'll see again and again, including on test day, are one, that the answer choices aren't that similar to each other. That's what makes it kind of difficult to move through these answer choices. It's because they're at different lengths, they start with different words, they have different forms, and they take your mind to a bunch of different places. Sometimes, especially in the stress of the moment on test day and when you're thinking about a whole lot of science, that can be hard to grasp. That's why you have to practice and get used to questions like this. Some other key patterns here are the wrong answer types. Remember, there's a whole lesson about this one. Answer choice A is a key opposite answer choice. It's really very, very close to being correct, except for the word not. Sure, the citric acid cycle would have trouble functioning, but only where this genetic defect actually was expressed, not in the tissues where it's not expressed. It might seem silly to highlight this as a tempting answer choice, but if you're reading really quickly and you miss that word, that's trouble for you. If you find yourself picking choices like choice A, then between now and test day, you need to put extra attention to every single word and looking out for those. That's the advantage you can get by getting extra practice. Choice A is an opposite choice, but choices B and D are what we call distortions. They even go a little bit extreme. Choice B is wrong because it says the whole organism would stop functioning. But as we see from the passage, sometimes organisms can live with these defects. And choice D goes a little too far because it suddenly says all tissues rather than just some tissues. Again, the passage itself says that these defects can be localized, often in neuromuscular tissues. And so choice D takes that from the passage and distorts it into something the passage didn't actually say. So that's what we can say about the wrong answers to this question, but the right answer is also a really important pattern that, again, you should be writing these down, which is that a weak answer choice, in this case one that just says, well, less NADH will get synthesized, doesn't go too far, doesn't speak too absolutely, it's often the correct answer. Because many times that's how biology works, that's how science works. It's not always a place of yeses and nos and absolutes. It's a realm of continuums where things go up and go down and have some flexibility, especially in biological systems. It's also much harder to disprove weak statements because they're weak and therefore they're more likely to be right answers as well. Let's move on to question 5 then. And question 5, to give you some context, this is on average the hardest question in this passage and really in this lesson. It's really tough content and a long and kind of hard to read question about that content. So if you got it right, congratulations. If you didn't, then, well, you're not alone and there's something you can learn from it. Question 5 says, well, what happens when we accumulate excess acetyl-CoA? One thing you should notice right away, especially if you're assessing questions and their answer choices, is that we have repetition in these answers. It's actually kind of the opposite of question 4. Every single one of these answers starts with acetyl-CoA, 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 acetyl-CoA. And then specifically what acetyl-CoA then does. What does it use to form, or where does it go when we've built up an excess of it? You may have also noticed, either at the forefront or in a corner of your mind, that this is a pseudo-discrete question. The passage and the diagram in it might help you answer, but ultimately, if you are really familiar with this biochemistry, you may just know the answer. You may also just not know the answer. Normally, we say pseudo-discretes are easier questions. You want to do them first, but there are also exceptions to the rule. Pseudo-discretes can be challenging. So before you even dived into this, when you see these, it's about this hard content, and there is repetition, but everything after then gets kind of muddled. You may just want to skip this question. Come back to it later. There's some really good tools in the test interface that allow you to review your incomplete questions or mark questions that you're not sure about or that you've guessed on, that allow you to come back to those questions later. If you don't use those tools, then you're not maximizing your performance. Questions like this, or pick your poison, what are the types of questions that are hard for you, are the ways you can use those tools to your advantage and maximize your performance. In any case, the correct answer here is B. Just like in the normal citric acid cycle, acetyl-CoA does form citrate when it builds up, but then it's turned into fatty acids. Fatty acids then often move to the liver to be stored as triacylglycerols, and as we probably know, that is what happens after a large meal. That energy tends to get stored as fat for later. As for the wrong choices, which might have tempted you here, choice A is wrong because even though it calls out beta oxidation, which is of course a real process, beta oxidation goes in the other direction. Beta oxidation is turning fatty acids into more immediately usable energy, not the other way around. Choice C is wrong because even though it calls out a legitimate reaction, it combining with oxaloacetate to become citrate, it identifies the wrong location. It says it moves to the cytoplasm, but the citric acid cycle occurs in mitochondria. And choice D is wrong because it talks about ketogenesis, but ketogenesis happens during a starvation state, not right after a large meal. So yeah, hard stuff if you're not familiar with the content. I mean, if you are, then great, but if you're not, then you've got to learn how to roll with these questions too when you see them on the test. Finally, number 6 lists some potential explanations for that phenomenon in the last paragraph of the passage. That genetic defects in the cycle might get observed in some tissues, but not in others. And as with many questions that have the "not" in it, you generally want to use an elimination strategy when you move through the answer choices here. Choice A is wrong because, well, if you have variations in gene transcription, then the gene with a defect might never get transcribed. That would explain a variation in expression. Same thing applies for choice D. It's wrong because maybe that gene's mRNA isn't getting translated into proteins. Perfectly plausible. Choice C is also wrong because it takes things one more step of the way. Maybe the defective gene gets transcribed and it gets translated and it even deals some damage, but some tissues can adapt to the problems. If the tissues can adapt to the problems, then you wouldn't be able to observe. Remember, the question said, which of these isn't a reason you would observe the defect? If tissues can adapt, you wouldn't observe the defect even if it was happening. And that means that choice D is correct. And choice D is really interesting logically because if it were true, if this did happen, it would be a potential explanation. However, it's not how genetics works. What choice D says is that there are variations in the very presence of the gene in the nuclei of certain cells. But the way genetics works is that all of the genes are in every nucleus. It's just not all of them eventually get transcribed to proteins in the same way. So that means choice D is not a potential explanation because it contradicts the science and it's correct. So what can we learn from this last question? Well, number 1, it's another one with repetition in the answer choices. Everyone says variations in this and this and this and this. If in your practice you have found you can deal with these repetitive answer choice questions, then that's a signal that this question is going to be a little easier for you. Second, this question takes the passage, specifically paragraph 2, and goes beyond it. In the same way that a science passage will take the basic content and go beyond it, a question then takes another step. Kind of like just earlier in this lesson, where we had the kidney countercurrent multiplier and we were asked to apply it to yet another situation, the heat exchange system. And then lastly, a key surface level pattern here is the knots. It might sound silly, but I'm sure it's happened to you before, where in a question like this, you get through choice A and choice B and you eliminate them for the right reasons. But then by the time you get to choice C, you've kind of forgot that you're looking for a knot. And you read it and you say, oh, that's a good explanation. And you pick it and you just move on. But again, that is an issue in attention. Now, you're not going to know whether that's an issue for you until you get tons and tons of practice. And if that issue shows up in your practice, you've got to look for it in the future and then try to attack it. There are a lot of little personal quirks that you're going to have in your strengths and weaknesses of your thought processes on the test. That is what prep is all about. Doing a lot of practice, identifying your relationship to the test, and molding that relationship to maximize your score. So we'll take a moment now to review all the strategies you've seen throughout this course. It's not a stretch to say that chapter 5 of your lesson book, all the lessons that start with the number 5, that this is the most important chapter in this book, the most important lessons to maximizing your score, because it's about MCAT, science, expertise, and 3/4 of the test is science. If you build that expertise, you're getting higher scores on 3/4 of the test. Super high yield. Lesson 5.1 was all about science passages and following the scan, read, label, and reflect strategy, forming a great passage outline with which to attack the questions. Then there's the question strategy, which was across 2 lessons. Lesson 5.2, which was about assessing a question at a glance and then making a plan. And then lesson 5.3, which was about executing the plan you make, specifically on whether to make a strong prediction, and then moving through the answer choices. And that strategy in 5.2 and 5.3 should have really illuminated over time the way that problem solving works on this test. Lesson 5.4 was about triaging the science sections, both on the passage and the question level. Then there were lessons about wrong answer types and how to guess when you don't have time or when a question is too hard. So in the end, this lesson and your prep for the science sections in general are about 2 main themes. The first is about strategy, good ways to mold your brain to attack these questions, and the second is about expertise. You have done and you will finish hundreds of hours of practice. Those hundreds of hours of practice is going to build a huge encyclopedia of experience for you, so that when you walk into the exam and you see your 200 some questions on the test, you're not going to see anything you haven't seen before. That's what expertise is all about. That is why you prepare for this exam. Go ahead, finish the rest of it. Bye.